Okay. As I mentioned earlier about sexual reproduction, it is kind of interesting that it even exists because, as we mentioned before, all else being equal, producing asexually, you could produce twice as many offspring. They would be clones for the most part, but they would be offspring. Okay. But of course, it greatly increases diversity, and actually selection actually works more efficiently in terms of beneficial alleles that are enhanced fitness. Just so you know, Dr. Tatiana's sex advice for all creation. Olivia Judson is an evolutionary biologist. Where is she? I think University of London or something like that. And she wrote this book on sex among all sorts of different creatures. Human sex is a pretty laid-back affair compared to a lot of other creatures that have sex. In some cases, like if you're a paramecium, having sex and producing offspring are completely separate affairs. Okay? So you might have two paramecium come together. Oh, by the way, they have many different sexes or types, not just male and female. They get together and they actually share their genomes, and if you came along and had sex with someone and incorporated their genes into your genome, you would be a completely different person. I mean, you know, you go from, oh, I feel pretty laid back now, and I just had sex with someone who makes me crazy, and now I'm crazy. Well, that would be like that. So you take on the phenotype. That's how they actually do things. And then later on down the line, they actually produce offspring clonally. But they've already had the sex during their lives, and they continue to. So their phenotype actually changes during their lives. There are other cases like the anglerfish that the female is very large. It has usually some kind of lure at the end of its nose or something, and it wiggles around, and fish come along and think it's something good to eat. And of course, they're sitting there, the females are large, and they just sit there, you know, like a mountain. And then all of a sudden, whoop, they're gone, right? So it turns out sex with anglerfish, the males are actually very small. All they really are sperm delivery devices. You could say that about most males. What they do is they swim around, they find a female, they actually embed in her and become a parasite. But they deliver sperm. So you're likely to see an anglerfish with a bunch of these things that seem to be attached to her. Well, they're males. She never lets them leave. Okay? She can also, by the way, store sperm, so she can decide, well, it's not really thinking I'm going to have, you know, Joey's sperm is probably better than Dave's or something like that. But a lot of animals do sort of store sperm, and they have kind of control over what sperm they actually use to fertilize the eggs. So if you ever want a good read, pretty amazing, that's a great book. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Eat, survive, reproduce. Eat, survive, reproduce. What's it all about? Okay. Now, of course, that's what we were talking about earlier, or what John was talking about. Eat, survive, reproduce. Obviously, having enough food. In almost every case, as education goes up and socioeconomic status, you know, the more resources you have, it's amazing, but usually the number of offspring you have goes down. Even though you would think, well, if you have more resources, you should actually have more children. Now, if you're Genghis Khan, then you did do that. But for the most part, that's what we found. Women in poor countries, or families in poor countries, if their daughters go to school, their sons go to school, they tend to have fewer children. How the human egg is often deceived. Well, what's interesting is that in birds, it turns out, they actually need to be fertilized by a whole bunch of different sperm. Only one actually uses its genetic material, but actually they need a whole bunch of different sperm. Of course, that's usually not a problem because sperm are a dime a billion, right? Okay. So as I mentioned earlier about how more efficient it would be just to clone yourself, it would be kind of nice too if I wish I had a doppelganger. So instead of being here with you, my doppelganger would be here, and I'd be at the beach surfing. But I'm not. And of course, if I had a doppelganger, it would be very much like me, so it might say, well, how come you get to go to the beach and I don't? But that's another thing. Anyway, sexual reproduction, if you actually think about it, is dangerous. If you asexually reproduce, you don't have to go anywhere. You know, you can just stay where you are, a safe place. If you actually have to go out and find someone to have sex with, individuals often put themselves at greater risk of predation, STDs, all sorts of different. If you're a male and you're a praying mantis, well, it'll be your last act. Okay, the female will bite your head off and then have sex with what's left over. Okay. Oh, and of course, cloning would be great, of course, unless the drawback of you don't like yourself. So then you're in trouble. But you're probably not going to produce offspring then anyway, so it won't really matter. Okay. Gametes. Are they diploid or haploid? Okay. Half your genome. It can be the half you got from your parents, from your mother, or from your father. And then there's been crossover, as we talked earlier. What kind of cell division it asks? Mitosis or meiosis? Yeah, okay. Okay. One parent is big, aggressive, and releases larger gametes. That's parent A. The other is parent is smaller, kind of cute, releases smaller gametes, and that's parent B. Which one is male and which one is female?
Parent A is male and parent B is female.
Okay. Now remember, parent A is big, okay, but also they have large gametes.
So that's female.
So it's female, okay. And then the other one, the smaller, kind of cute, small gametes, that's the male. That's how we define male and female. Now there's some some species produce, they do isogamy, which is there's no difference between gametes. They still have sex, but there's not male and female. In fact, the whole idea of what's called anisogamy, which is where you have two different size gametes, is actually kind of strange. But you can say that being bigger or being very small has advantages, and you can't do both. Now, also, by the way, we usually think of males as being bigger and more aggressive, and females as being less so. So humans have what's called sexual size dimorphism. Males and females are different sizes. If you actually look at, let's say, other apes, in some cases you have greater sexual size dimorphism. So gorillas, for example, the male silverbacks, they have a harem of females. They keep all the other males away. And they're usually up to like 500 or 600 pounds, and the females are about, up to maybe 250. Okay? So very large sexual size dimorphism. Chimpanzees, there's size dimorphism there, about perhaps the same as ours. There's some gibbons, which are the lesser apes, in some cases that are actually completely monogamous. Unlike ourselves, we're kind of serially monogamous, where they form long-term bonds and they stay together, and where you have no sexual size dimorphism. In general, since males have lots of sperm and females have only fewer eggs and larger eggs, females provide more resources, and they have fewer gametes, and so they are usually choosier compared to the males. This only changes if males, in fact, start providing a lot of resources to offspring. And then in those cases, you can actually get what's called reverse size dimorphism, and where the male is actually choosy, like the seahorse. So with a seahorse, the female actually lays her eggs in the pouch. He gets pregnant. He provides the sperm. The offspring grow inside his pouch, and then they're born live. Okay, so in that case, the males are usually choosy, and the females are the ones that are competing for, mates. There's all kinds of different fertilization. Now, I think I had some questions about whether plants produce sexually. Do plants produce sexually? Yeah. The pollen is the same as sperm. It's male gametes. They're small. The females are the seeds. And then, of course, plants can't get around. And so they have to have ways to have their gametes get from one place to another. And so a lot of plants, they either produce tons and tons and tons, or the males do produce tons and tons and tons of pollen that blow in the wind, or they get animals to do the work for them by providing some sort of benefit like nectar. Okay? A lot of animals use external fertilization, or a lot of organisms do. On the left and the bottom, you see coral, and it turns out if in one species they all release their gametes at the same time, even though they're not necessarily next to each other or right next to each other, but it's timed so that they all do. And in fact, oftentimes in places where there are many different species of coral, there's different times for different species. So they release tons and tons of gametes, eggs and sperm. That's how fertilization takes place. And then the fertilized egg turns into larvae, which tend to swim around and float around for a long time. And then there's a lot of other animals that, like salmon, external fertilization. There's pros and cons to actually external fertilization versus internal fertilization. You don't really have to know this, but in like lizards, there's a lot of cases where there's they do both. Okay, different species, but closer related to each other. Okay. Internal fertilization, obviously in animals, very common. When I talked about paramecium, well, they're one-celled organisms, so it's not exactly the same. And there's all different kinds of ways to have sex. A lot of individuals have internal fertilization. There's some benefits to that. First of all, the eggs are fertilized that way, and they might stay within the female for a while until she finally finds a place to, bury the eggs, like turtles do. Okay. One thing that internal fertilization allowed or permitted was that drier climates. You could actually have fertilization in a place where there wasn't enough water. So a lot of amphibians, which were the first land animals, they're required to stay close to water. They often lay their eggs in water, whether it's a frog or a salamander, whatever. The amount of parental care differs. Individuals who just lay eggs, well, the male, neither of them actually show any parental care necessarily. The females, though, provide more resources because eggs are bigger. And the offspring, as they develop, are going to be using the resources provided in the egg. Okay. But there's other cases where males provide a lot of parental care, like penguins, where each parent goes off at one time or another, and the other one just sits there warming the eggs or the chicks. Okay. I think I talked about Nemo, clownfish. There are some animals that undergo what's called sequential hermaphrodites, which means that they start out as one sex and then become another. They don't have the problem that people do, where males and females have such a hard time understanding each other, because usually by one point in their lives they've already gone through both. Plants, for the most part, are all hermaphrodites. Most plants have what are called perfect flowers. They have males and female parts. But there's usually some mechanism to prevent what's called selfing. That means self-fertilization. So the pollen may be released or made available at a different time than when the pistils were receptive to pollen. Here is a praying mantis. It turns out, at least in the insect world, that a lot of females may be bigger, and they may actually eat their male counterparts. But it's still part of sex. In fact, the male actually it becomes kind of like a nuptial gift. He provides resources to the female, namely food, that she can then divert to her eggs and her offspring. Now, some other males have gotten around this by actually, let's say, catching a nuptial gift and giving it to the female. And then while she's eating it, he can copulate with her, and there's usually a positive relationship between the size of the nuptial gift and how long he can copulate. Depending on the life history, so you probably know that a lot of spiders, the females eat the males. So like for the black widow, the females are bigger. They eat the male. Usually it's because the chances of a male finding another female are very low. Now, of course, he would still probably like to not get eaten, I would imagine. But under those circumstances, getting eaten actually enhances the male's individual fitness because he provides resources, his own body, towards offspring. Okay? So any of you guys in here and get into a relationship where your spouse kills you, well, she's probably not going to eat you, so never mind. Okay. Oh, yeah. So here's an anglerfish. And you can actually see okay, here we go. These are males. Once they embed, they basically are just sperm delivery devices. That's all they are. They're germline gamete producers. Some more of them, just a gonad. So the volume of the egg is usually a lot bigger than sperm. As I mentioned, it's called anisogamy, where you have two different size gametes. And what it does is it tends to, if you think about reproductive fitness, which we've talked about in the past, females tend to be choosier because they provide more resources, just the size of the egg, and then if they provide parental care, even more. And so they have to be choosy, whereas males, the thing that limits their reproductive fitness is usually the number of females they mate with. But it turns out females actually, in a lot of cases, mate with a number of males anyway because of genetic incompatibility, all sorts of different issues. Let's see here. So this is pretty much what we've gone through previously in terms of meiosis 1, meiosis 2, and then specialization. Okay, male reproductive anatomy. Okay, so you do have to know this. I'm sure you already do. Testes produce sperm. Ovaries produce eggs. Okay. Yeah, as far as semen, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. The prostate gland releases fluid that makes up part of the semen so that the sperm can actually survive. Sperm can generally only survive for so long outside. of the body. So oogenesis. So before we look at spermatogenesis, meiosis pauses until puberty, and then the eggs are actually released. Well, there's been some question about this recently. It used to be thought that females, all the eggs that they have are produced when they're very, very young. And then it's only when they reach puberty that they actually start releasing mature eggs. But that might be untrue at this point. Okay. Okay, so ovaries, uterus, vagina. The eggs are released from the ovaries. The ovaries, oh, by the way, the testes produce what is it called? Testosterone. Right. The ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. Progesterone has mainly to do with the egg, fertilized egg being implanted into the uterus. Okay? Of course, every month an egg is released. There can be problems, of course, during this cycle. You can actually get something called an ectopic pregnancy, where the egg is actually fertilized in the fallopian tubes, and then it continues to grow. The embryo. That's serious. Without medical attention, oftentimes a woman will actually die from that. Those are called ectopic pregnancies. So, where does fertilization happen? Let's see. I forget. Maybe it'll. Okay, here we go. Normally, one egg each month is released from the ovary. It takes the egg about 5 days to move through the oviducts to the uterus. Oh, that's right. So, how long is sperm viable? We'll get to the other question later. So, the egg each month is released, and the egg about 5 days to move from the oviducts to the uterus. That means that sperm have to be viable for up to 5 days. So eggs are viable for the first 24 hours after ovulation. Fertilization can result from sex up to 5 days prior to ovulation until 1 day after. Okay, so you have sperm that can last up to 5 days. Fertilization takes place in the oviducts, by the way. So it can take a while to get up there, and then, of course, after ovulation, the egg is only viable for 1 day. There's something kind of interesting about humans. Most female animals, when it's time to reproduce, go into what's called estrus. In other words, they're not sexually receptive or able to reproduce until at certain times of the year. This has a lot to do with hormones. So, like birds, once the sun angle changes, then that usually triggers hormonal changes in the female, and it starts the whole cycle. And then once they're done reproducing, then it shuts off. This is especially important in birds, let's say, because ovaries and testes increase in size, but they also increase weight. And so when you're not needing them to reproduce, you don't need them and they actually shrink. Okay. But humans actually have what's called concealed ovulation. Okay? Males, in general, there's some question about this, but males in general don't know when females are ovulating. Okay? And now there's some new stuff that says that women smell different when they're ovulating. Males are not necessarily knowing, oh, she's ovulating, but they seem to be more attentive during ovulation. Okay? And attentive, what I mean is that there's this whole idea about, okay, as a male, I can either go out and have lots of sex with lots of different females, or I can stay next to my mate and make sure she doesn't mate with anybody else. Okay? Can't usually do two things at once. And so this is called mate guarding. This is the whole basis for jealousy, all that kind of stuff. Like that picture with that young girl and that old ugly Afghan guy, right? That's kind of religiously sanctioned mate guarding. She goes from her father's house to the new husband's house, and he basically owns her. So mate guarding is one way to ensure paternity. That's the whole idea. You want to ensure paternity. Now, if you're Genghis Khan, you have a harem of so many females. You probably also have a whole bunch of eunuchs that are protecting the females so that no other males can get into the harem. Okay? And then he can father a whole bunch of offspring. For the most part, there's a lot of what we'll call monogamy in humans. And in that case, the male has to find some way to mate guard, but he doesn't necessarily know when ovulation is. So it kind of makes him stick around. So the hypothesis, what's the hypothesis for concealed ovulation? Anybody? Okay. Hypothesis. Males, there's concealed ovulation well, I'll give you the idea. To keep males around. What do males do? When males are around, they're likely to provide protection for the female and resources as well. Even if they're not very good providers, if they go out and they hunt, their companion is probably going to get some food out of it. So the hypothesis is that concealed ovulation is to provide an incentive for males to stay close to the female to ensure their paternity and not some other males. You know, like the milkman. Okay? Now, as I've mentioned, there does seem to be perhaps some evidence that males might know when females actually are ovulating, but they don't know consciously, obviously. Okay. Oh, Plan B. This is the morning after pill. A lot of misinformation about this. Plan B, a lot of people have been told that it actually produces an abortion. It's not true. It prevents ovulation. Okay? There's a big difference. So if you have a problem with abortion, you can still use Plan B. Frankly, I feel it's up to the woman as far as I'm concerned. Okay, but, you know, the government has no business there, especially a whole bunch of ugly southern white guys. Okay, now, why are they doing that? It's mate guarding. Again, even though they don't, actually, they want to control women's behavior. Like, it would be great if females could be maidens like in the old days. They stay with their father, then they're betrothed at a young age, and then they belong to their husband. Okay? And the idea that women might actually have their own sexual agenda, well, that's not good. It makes men very, very, very nervous. Okay? As you can well imagine. Now, the fertilized egg, remember, the fertilized egg contains the whole genome. It's diploid. It's got homologous chromosomes, one from the male and one from the female. How do you get from a zygote to a human being? Well, as you can well imagine, it's a very tightly controlled developmental process. We have something called Hox genes. A lot of, it turns out, almost all animals have some Hox genes. I think insects have 9 Hox genes that are homologous with what we have, plus we have an extra 4, 13. Okay? Hox genes are kind of the master switches in terms of development. Under certain conditions, they make cells divide. They start causing differentiation in cell type. In body plan, where the limb buds are, where the different organs are, we have 3 layers where we have an endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. The ectoderm usually controls, well, our skin and also our nervous system. The mesoderm, a lot of our organs. And then endoderm, oh, I forget, you can look it up. But anyway, so there's a lot of things that have to happen. These Hox genes, at one point, once an individual reaches maturity, they're actually silenced after that. You don't want to start growing a new leg out of your neck at a certain point. So they have to be very, very stringently regulated. And usually they're regulated in terms of gene expression by the cellular and hormonal environment that they're in. And they, of course, actually, these Hox genes play a role in hormones and all that as well. You start with a zygote, 2 cells, 4 cells, 8 cells. You finally get to something called a blastocyst. This is a cross-section of a blastocyst. The embryo is usually at the blastocyst stage when it implants into the uterus lining. Now, as I mentioned, you can get a situation where it actually doesn't make it to the uterus and starts growing in the fallopian tubes, and then there's a real problem. Okay? And usually this happens within the first 6 days of fertilization. And then from then on, we start seeing some real developmental changes that are going on here. So you start getting asymmetries in which the Hox genes control, well, when they get dialed up or dialed down, and then they affect genes in different cells for differentiating into various types of cells. By the way, this is a situation where you can actually get embryonic stem cells, okay, which are pluripotent. We'll learn a bit more about that maybe by the end of this lecture. But essentially stem cells, depending on what kind of stem cells they are, can turn into any different type of cells. Now, adult stem cells are immature cells that can only turn into one type of tissue. Okay? So they might be good. Let's say there's a lot of work going on now. I just read something on growing vocal cords for people who've had damage to their vocal cords. And in that case, what they do is they harvest stem cells from the vocal cords and then grow them on a matrix, and then actually, they haven't done it on humans yet, but they've done it on mice and rats. So it might be in the future. Okay. But anyway, the cell division continues, and of course, you get development to all these different systems. Oh yeah, okay. So I mentioned hormones. Now, we know that in terms of females, females produce estrogen and progesterone. Those are the female sex hormones. Males produce testosterone. But there's actually other hormones that are kind of higher level hormones. I think gonadotropin, luteinizing hormone or something like that. That actually then also affects the hormone production in the testes or the ovaries. Okay. Now, the placenta. Now, there's a lot of animals, of course, that lay eggs, and then the eggs hatch outside the body, so you don't need anything like that. Birds have that. Makes a lot of sense because most birds fly, or their ancestors did, and carrying around an egg would be costly in terms of weight. It also turns out that there are even egg-laying mammals. I think I've mentioned that. In Australia, there's the monotreme, which is a spiny anteater, and then there's the platypus. And they actually lay eggs. They split off from, I guess, reptiles probably 200 million years ago. Actually before crocodiles and birds split off, which was actually later than that. Okay. Now, in terms of live-bearing young, there's some advantages to it. First, you can actually control where your offspring are going to be born. What kind of environment? So if you actually lay eggs and something bad happens, you can't exactly move them easily, right? Okay, so if you carry them around until it's time for birthing, then you have more control. But of course, there's also cost to that as well. It turns out there are different kinds of mammals. There are, of course, egg-laying mammals, and then there are placental mammals, and there are also marsupial mammals. Okay, a placenta is basically the go-between between a fetus and the mother. At this point, the mother provides everything to the growing fetus. Oxygen, all the nutrients. In fact, fetal blood and fetal hemoglobin is actually different than adult hemoglobin. Okay? Because usually once oxygen-carrying cells, the red blood cells, get to the placenta, they usually have less concentration of oxygen than they would otherwise. So fetal hemoglobin is actually more sensitive and captures and retains oxygen than you would otherwise find. At day 7, the embryo, is implanted. Let's see, fertilization, zero. Okay, now let's see. Once the placenta forms, it produces progesterone, which actually maintains the pregnancy. Of course, there's also, once an individual is actually pregnant, you have to stop menstruation and you have to stop releasing eggs once a month. And so this hormone HCG prevents that, okay? Oh yeah, so the embryo, this is a human chorionic gonadotropin, which is what home pregnancy tests actually detect. So it's a hormone. It means it's actually a protein of some form or another with active sites that are absolutely necessary for maintaining a pregnancy. The endometrium, which is part of the uterus lining, if there's not enough HCG being produced, it'll be shed within 14 days after ovulation.
So I think the incidence of miscarriage is like 20 to 25%.
Mm-hmm.
Is that, do you know, why is it like the placenta, like there's something wrong where it's not making progesterone and so it...
There's a number of different reasons. Right, okay. One thing has to do, like you said, with not implanting correctly in the placenta, not producing the right hormones or enough hormones, things like that. It turns out that probably 50% of miscarriages have nothing to do with that. They have to do with lethal mutations. So they get to a certain point, sometimes a zygote, and that's poof, it's gone. Sometimes after a number of months, there's some lethal mutation, let's say a mutation that affects nervous system development, and then you end up with a fetus that becomes unviable at a certain point. And then there's another thing that's going on too, genetic incompatibility. You might think, well, I mean, one sperm and one egg for humans, one is as good as the other, right? It doesn't turn out that way. It actually, there are certain genomes that are more compatible than others. We often hear about women who are having real trouble conceiving. Okay, why is that? Well, of course, it could be the husband, low sperm count. It could be the woman with, in terms of manufacturing eggs that are viable and worth something. But it often turns out that it's genetic incompatibility. The genomes don't really fit. When they do, if they even actually get fertilization, it usually aborts very quickly. Now, this is controlled because the male and female interests are sometimes different. Especially, now primates usually only have one offspring. But in a lot of cases, like dogs, you can have a female dog that actually, the different embryos in her are fathered by different offspring. I mean, by different fathers. So there's competing interests among embryos of different fathers and different fathers' interests. And there's something called genomic imprinting, where fathers actually chemically try to get more resources going to their offspring and not to other fathers' offspring. But this is a holdover from back then, because humans only usually have one father and one offspring. Okay. So you have this compatibility problem where, for some reason, the genomes don't line up and you don't produce fertile offspring. Sometimes you hear about, oh, a woman says, I can't get pregnant. She's already been in a relationship, and then she's now in another relationship, and she tells the guy, I can't get pregnant. Lo and behold, a couple of months later, she's pregnant. Now, the guy thinks she's lying to me. Well, no. It turns out that she might not have been able to get pregnant because the guys that she was with before, the genomes were incompatible. The new guy, the genomes are compatible. So, of course, she wasn't using contraception, right? Because she can't get pregnant. So there's probably, I don't know what the percentage is, but genetic incompatibility has a lot to do with the kinds of problems that result in miscarriages.
So what if a couple that is not compatible goes has fertility treatment?
It's a good idea.
But then, does that, I mean,
well, you don't know.
I don't think there's an incidence of, like, mutated children because of that, though.
Well, not necessarily.
You're just saying they have trouble, like, maintaining
or sometimes it's in trouble, in fact, even producing a viable zygote, just one cell.
Yeah.
Okay? Things just do not line up. So that appears to be one of the biggest things that causes failed pregnancies. Now, there's a bunch of other things. There's hormonal imbalances, all that kind of stuff. But one way, of course, is to go out and, let's say a woman can't get pregnant. Well, then you go to a sperm bank, or you go to your husband's best friend, or whatever it is. Right? Okay. So it doesn't mean that a woman can't get pregnant. It might just be a matter of genetic compatibility. Of course, then you could say, well, if we're genetically incompatible, then maybe we're just incompatible, and it's time to move on. But not necessarily. Okay. Plan B. Okay, so morning after, right. Delaying ovulation after sex. You can prevent ovulation. Obviously, birth control pills. You can use Depo-Provera injections. You can use an implant-on stick, or IUDs. Now, I want you to know, he mentioned earlier that the amount of estrogen in a birth control pill is like 2 orders of magnitude less than it was in the past. They have implantable things that release hormones over a longer period of time. Also, IUDs, in the past, a lot of times women didn't tolerate them, but they're much smaller now, and they appear to be much more effective. And you can, if you take them out, of course, you can then get pregnant after that. And so a lot of women use IUDs. They work actually very well now. So the technology is much better. Of course, since guys are basically sperm delivery devices, they still don't have to worry about any of this, right? I mean, it's really amazing that they haven't come up with male contraception in all these years. Now, I mean, there's problems, of course, you know. Hormonal stuff might affect desire, performance, and all that stuff, but it does for women too. So I'm just kind of surprised that there really isn't something for men. Now, of course, you can always get a vasectomy, and they can be reversible, but most guys don't even think about it, of course. I mean, guys aren't really thinking about it a lot of the times anyway. They just want to have sex. Of course, women aren't thinking about a lot of times, and they just want to have sex. Okay. And then, of course, there's other ways to prevent condoms, diaphragms, abstinence. Now, as you know, there's abstinence-only sex education. Those areas tend to have the highest number of out-of-wedlock pregnancies anywhere. So apparently, abstinence-only education really works if you want to get pregnant. Okay? So, just so you know, if you really want to get pregnant, practice abstinence-only, and I assure you, I think it can even overcome genetic incompatibility. Okay. I might get in trouble for that one, too. Okay. Now, there's also this pill that actually induces abortions. It's called RU486, and it's also generally mixed with a drug called methotrexate. It causes the placenta to not maintain pregnancy, and then within a day or two, you end up with an abortion. And you're only supposed to take it within the first trimester, or maybe 2 trimesters. I'm not sure. That's probably a little late. Yeah.
In relation to the morning after pill, like Plan B,
yeah,
I've heard that it's like really unhealthy for women to take it if she takes like more than once in a month.
Uh-huh.
Isn't it bad for her?
I don't know. It very well might be.
Yeah.
I mean, just think about it. It's probably bad for her to take, the pill compared to, we don't have to suffer that. The only problem that we have is that we have to suffer through testosterone poisoning, okay, which makes men do all sorts of crazy things, and that's why we really can't be held accountable.
Doesn't it make you die earlier? Isn't that why men have like 5 years less than women because
they have
testosterone? Because of testosterone, men have a shorter lifespan.
Oh yeah, testosterone kills. Oh yeah, it's well known, absolutely. First of all, what are the sources of mortality for men? Anybody in here? What do you think?
Accidents.
Yeah, men get into a lot of accidents. Why? Impulsive. What are they? Why are they? How would? Now, why wouldn't evolution by natural selection reduce such impulsivity? What's the rewards? Women. Yeah. Men taking risks. This is part of the handicap principle, right? If you're an extraordinary male, you can afford to take the risks, and you'll probably still live. Whereas a lower quality male will either can't take the risk, or if he tries, it'll kill him. I think I'm a low quality male. Anyway, oh, by the way, you get to be lower and lower quality as you get older too. Now,
unless you get richer.
What?
Unless you get richer.
Well, that's true. In fact, Strom Thurmond, who was a well-known congressman from South Carolina, he was a segregationist. It turns out he had a bunch of children who are mixed race, we'll say, right? It didn't seem to stop them from having sex, but at the same time, I don't think it turns out he didn't support those children as well as the other ones. He married about 5 different times. They were mainly Miss South Carolina. Okay, and he lived until he had kids when he was in his 90s. It was extraordinary. Okay. So, obviously, men don't want anything to impede their ability to fertilize women. Okay? Paternity. We have to maintain our paternity, even if we don't want to use it. Like, we don't want to have a whole bunch of squealing kids. running around, right? Actually, having kids reduces your lifespan. It's been shown statistically, and you can understand why. Even the best kids are going to cause you grief at some point in their lives. Now, of course, you can hope that there's such a strong sense of children being subservient to their parents that they actually help their parents in old age, provide for them, and actually get them to live longer. They're kind of payback. But normally the kind of payback they get now is they just stick their parents in an old home and don't see them anymore. And that's fine if your mother was a shrew or your father was a warlock or something like that. You don't want anything to do with them, but otherwise you do have a little bit of responsibility there. So anyway, now you can actually get this through the mail. Unfortunately, in certain states, they make it very hard to get, and if they find out a woman is actually getting it through the mail, they confiscate it. Okay? Because they say, well, you really shouldn't take this drug unless you're under a doctor's supervision. Of course, you could be under a doctor's supervision, and maybe he can't get it, but you can. But anyway, it's actually a very safe way to have abortions. It was thought to be a game changer at one point, but it hasn't really turned out to be that way. So anyway, what it does is it stops progesterone signals from maintaining pregnancy. So you actually have a pregnancy, fertilization, development, implantation, but you can't maintain the pregnancy. Oh, which one protects against STDs? Let's see.
Just abstinence.
Yeah, preventing sperm and eggs from meeting. Condoms. Not diaphragms. Female condoms. And of course abstinence. That's the best way to get pregnant. Okay. So, STDs are, and listen, STDs can be a real problem. Obviously, there's HIV. There's a famous, in the 17th century England, Lord Rochester, there was a film about him with Johnny Depp was in it. And Lord Rochester was notorious. Oh, by the way, the English called it the French pox. And of course, the French called it the English pox. The main thing was syphilis, right? And eventually, Lord Rochester, at a very young age, he died from kind of long-term syphilis. It tends to make people organ failure, makes people go crazy. It's surprising that he actually lived that long and didn't get run through with a sword, because he was also a great sword fighter. And he was also a great poet. If you like bawdy poetry, read Lord Rochester. So there again you see this incidence of men who can afford it actually taking chances, showing risky behavior. And if you think about it, let's say you have a guy, two guys. One guy who takes a risk, the other guy who's low quality and doesn't, or does but doesn't live very long. Even if the guy who does take the risk dies young, he's still likely to have far more many children than a low quality individual. So he only lives until, 22 years old. But in that time, he can do a lot of damage. Okay? So, anyway, the only method, and even condoms don't necessarily protect against all sorts of STDs. Okay? A good example is the one that causes genital warts. Well, males can actually get it, usually in their throats from oral sex. Okay. Oh, it says, oh, no sex. Yeah, well, that's the best way. Well, who's going to do that? Anyway, mode of action. Okay. Okay. The rhythm method, of course, not very effective. That's all we really have to say about that. Okay. Infertility. Now, as you mentioned about adoption, that's certainly an option for a lot of couples that are infertile or can't have an offspring. Unfortunately, like you mentioned, it's expensive, right? I mean, it's really expensive. Okay. But you can also infertility treatments, but by the way, those are really expensive. You know, I mean, we're talking tens of thousands of dollars, and there's no way to actually assure that it actually works. Okay. In vitro fertilization, you could basically take sperm and egg and mix them and plant them into the woman, and hopefully it takes. A lot of times they harvest the woman's eggs, a bunch of them, and many times they implant a number of different, they put a number of different eggs and implant a number because most of the time it doesn't work, and maybe one might actually result in an offspring. Okay. This is not the same as cloning. The first test tube baby was back in the 70s, I guess, something like that in Great Britain. Oh, here she is. The lovely Louise, 1978. And it was sensational at the time. There was a lot of conflict, you know, are we playing God, things like that. Like I said, though, they've gotten much better at it in terms of the techniques, but it still oftentimes doesn't work. Or sometimes it works, and you end up with 8 identical brothers and sisters, or brothers or sisters, right? Which is great, because even if you don't have any offspring, and you're one of those, if your other ones have offspring, you're getting the same reproductive benefit as they are. You don't have offspring, but they do. Since you're 100% related, they share the identical genes, you have your, you know, 1/8, they're one of the 8 that were born, can pretty much do all the reproduction for all of them. Okay, one thing they do, they cause superovulation, hormonal stuff again, and retrieval. Depending on male fertility, the eggs can be fertilized or injected with a sperm nucleus. Okay, so a lot of times you've got sperm that could fertilize, but they're pretty kind of defective. Oh, by the way, males actually decline in sperm viability and fertility as they age. Didn't seem to affect strom-thurmond, but you know. And then what they do is they either mix them, sperm and eggs, in a test tube, or they actually take a sperm and inject it into the egg. So the zygote is allowed to divide up to produce an embryo. When the embryo reaches the blastocyst stage, it's then transferred to the uterus. Okay, right. Oh, and then let's see. Oh, what's going on? There we go. Okay. As you can see, also, this is how it kind of goes through. You can actually see here ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. So we have 3 layers. Some animals only have 2 of tissue layers. And then 2 to 4 embryos are generally transferred to increase the chances of successful implantation. And so, obviously, in that case, you can end up with a number of different identical offspring. Actually, not necessarily. That's right. It actually, a lot of times, in fact, they're not identical offspring because you've got sperm that is from the same individual, right? But they're different sperm. Each sperm has different, complements of where they got their DNA. So a lot of times it's mainly fraternal twins or fraternal numbers. I think that's enough for now. Any questions? Okay. I opened up Top Hat in terms of the stuff that we covered. And I'll leave it open, I don't know, until Monday or something like that. And that'll be that. Make sure I'll change the due date on the population thing, and make it until like Sunday at midnight or something like that. Okay. Oh, the last test, everybody did really well. So. So, in terms of reproductive technologies, there's a lot of stuff going on. We talked a little bit about IVF. That's where we kind of ended up. There's all kinds of different methods that are being used. They're now talking about perhaps if they find out that an embryo has mutation, they might be able to actually fix it like in the very, very early stages by gene therapy. Anyway, this is what can happen if you have IVF and things kind of get away. I think this is eight of them. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah.
But she already had twins or something before. She's
What?
an 8.
Yeah.
I mean 8 and 1. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. Anyway, I don't know if I could handle that. I might have to shoot myself. So what happens is usually the embryos, what they do is they give hormones so that a woman will release a bunch of different eggs, and they'll harvest those, and then they'll let the embryos actually develop in culture, and this is after fertilization. And then these blastocysts can actually be frozen or saved for later implantation. Of course, you've probably heard about, they've been frozen and the two people get divorced and there's a fight over the, frozen embryos. So usually it goes, if they both want to save them, that's great. If they don't, then usually they get destroyed. These are 8-celled embryos, though, just so you know. Oh, yeah. So you can actually store these for a long time. And there's ethical issues You can read about it, actually. Now, they are good for something, and that is stem cells. In fact, it was the only way to actually harvest what are called pluripotent stem cells. In other words, cells that can turn into any kind of cell in the body. Those are the magic bullets, okay, for everything in terms of stem cell work, including regenerating tissue and organs, all sorts of different things. So, we have a stem cell. It can divide throughout its lifetime, and then it has the ability to give rise to any type of cell. And then, once it gets to this stage, it can terminally differentiate into a cell type. And there are adult stem cells, too. So usually, the thing that gives rise to an adult cell is an adult stem cell that's already kind of gone along a certain path to development and can't go back to the pluripotent state. Okay. So here we have blood cells. Let's see. These are immune cells, heart muscle, and smooth muscle, neural, structural, signaling cells, all sorts of different things. So a stem cell, an embryonic stem cell, can turn into anything. Now, what's going on is cells are, we talked about a life of different cell types. Like skin cells turn over fairly regularly, days and weeks. Let's see, blood cells, month or a couple of months. Muscle cells, a lot less. Some almost never, you never get new ones, like neural cells supposedly, but it's questionable. And they're replenished from these stem cells. So, these adult tissues, they contain stem cells, but they're not pluripotent. That means being able to turn into everything. They're able to turn into the kind of tissue for which you actually find them. So, this is skin. And these are, of course, these are, adult skin cells. Here's some terminal differentiation, but right here, these are the stem cells give rise to skin tissue. Okay, and they're always going to be creating new skin tissue. Okay, and then it gets to what's called terminal differentiation, where that's it. It's an adult, working cell that does what it's supposed to do, all that kind of stuff. Okay, so stem cells also, they can give rise to limited types, but they can reverse muscle atrophy in let's say elderly mice. So if they actually use them, implant them, those stem cells will actually turn into adult or good muscle tissue. Now, there's another way you can actually do that, and that's you hook up a young mouse with an adult mouse, and lo and behold, the old mouse turns into a young mouse. Because there's factors in the blood that actually do that. They're looking at that now in terms of human beings. So it reverses the effects of aging. Maybe eventually I'll get hooked up to a mouse. At least I'll be a young mouse. You know, there's something to be said for that, except, well, we'll see. Okay, so now, of course, we use stem cells for, let's say, tissue regeneration. Wound healing involves adult stem cells. But as we mentioned, it can only go so far. It can only turn into those kinds of cells and not any others. So, let me see this. So these are planaria. They're a flatworm. And it's interesting. If you cut these up, you can actually grow new planaria from each little piece. And you can do this with other things too, like starfish. You can cut off an arm of a starfish and it'll grow into a new starfish. You can get limb regeneration with salamanders. But the question, how come we can't do it with us? Well, there's certain things going on with them, not with us. So here we have newts. These are a type of salamander. And you can see, if you actually, let's say, remove the arm or the leg, that eventually it will form a limb bud, 3 to 6 weeks, and then finally 6 to 9 weeks you can actually see it differentiating into an actual arm with the phalanges, metacarpals, all that kind of stuff with a hand. So not all stem cells are the same. They have what's called potency. And it turns out that with planaria, and starfish, and salamanders, those cells that eventually differentiate into an arm. Now, what's an arm? What kind of tissue is in an arm? What's the underlying tissue? Anybody? Just think of one kind of tissue.
Muscle tissue?
Muscle? Huh?
Muscle, skin tissue.
Huh?
Muscle.
Yeah, muscle.
Skin.
Skin.
Bone.
Bone.
Veins. Veins.
Veins. Circulatory system. Nerves. Connective tissue. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. So with these guys, they obviously don't have what we would typically call adult stem cells that are going to be turned into, let's say, muscle tissue, period. They have stem cells that have more potency. They can turn into many more different things. So, in fact, that's why we don't have genes like that turn into, let's say, a limb. We have genes that control other genes that make all these things happen, but a limb has all sorts of things going on with it, including it needs a blood supply, right? And that's covered by other genes, including you have growth factors that then turn on and off those genes. But anyway, in terms of potency, they can turn into many different cell types in that case. Okay, now, in this case, we've got these different kinds of stem cells. So this is the kind of blastocyst that we were talking about. And this is what's called a pluripotent stem cell. That means it can actually turn into anything, any kind of tissue that's in your body. Now, in the very early embryo, they're actually called totipotent. In fact, they're more potent than pluripotent. But they can form all the cells and the placenta. Okay? So totipotent cells can form all the different tissue plus the placenta. It's the basis for the placenta. But the ones that we're really concerned about are pluripotent stem cells. So here we have, of course, the totipotent. So these are the embryonic stem cells that are so great. Now, cord blood stem cells and placental stem cells actually contain what are called multipotent. They're more potent than adult stem cells, but less potent than pluripotent stem cells. Okay? So that's why they oftentimes collect cord blood. Salute. Okay, so this is kind of how it goes. Pluripotent, blood stem cells, muscle, all these other ones. All these right here are called multipotent. Okay. Now, thanks to President Bush, there were some stem cell lines that were already in existence when he put a halt to it. So there's, in other words, these lines that can be used in research, but not any other stem cell lines. Now, I think Obama probably relaxed some of those, I'm pretty sure. There's also the fact that there's work that says that supposedly they've been able to take like skin cells and then reverse them all the way into pluripotent stem cells. But I keep hearing it is and it isn't. So apparently they still need actually, you know, embryonic stem cells for certain things. There's a number of people here working on that kind of stuff. Cindy Malone, Mary Pat Stein. Okay. Now, you can imagine, if you can turn things into any kind of cell, you could turn dead nerve cells that are not producing, let's say, dopamine, into new nerve cells that produce dopamine, which is one of the main neurotransmitters. If you have an extra amount of dopamine, it usually makes you feel really good, just so you know. So Parkinson's disease. In fact, they've done this already. It kind of works, not entirely. There's these cells in the brain that die. No one's exactly sure why. It could be environmental toxins. It could be some hereditary thing in some cases. And Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease. You see it with people, you know, who are shaking. And eventually they get to the point where they get kind of frozen. It's difficult for them to move at all. Now, if you they've tried implanting these, and with new stem cells that turn into these kinds of cells, and it helps, but only for a limited amount of time. Now, this was actually, not this part, but this was discovered. Anybody know who Oliver Sacks was? Okay, he died recently. He is a neurologist. You've probably seen some of the, well, one of the movies that was made about his stuff, about Awakenings, where he was on a ward with people who had encephalitis, St. Louis encephalitis, and they got infected years ago, and they didn't die, but they were unresponsive. And just around that time, they found out that dopamine was responsible for, let's say, Parkinson's, and they thought, and a lot of these patients kind of showed Parkinson's-like symptoms. And so we gave them dopamine. And they all woke up after 30 years. And what they said was that they were actually conscious the whole time. Stuck in a body, like locked away somewhere, and you could never get out. So, and then unfortunately, well, if you keep giving people dopamine, you get all sorts of problems, including hallucinations, a lot of different things. So you can't keep, it'd be one thing if you can, oh, this is simple, you just keep giving them dopamine, but you can't. And also, by the way, dopamine, now in this case, for Parkinson's, is dopamine from these cells in a specific part of the brain. Nerve cells make, a lot of different nerve cells make dopamine, but they make it in differing amounts for different parts. So the amount of dopamine that's, let's say, released in the neocortex is different than in the temporal lobe or something like that. And that's, in fact, why certain, like antidepressants, like serotonin reuptake inhibitors, where it stops the reuptake of serotonin, well, it works on all of those cells that that actually use serotonin as a neurotransmitter, and at equal amounts across the brain. And so that's why they don't work exactly perfectly, because what you'd want is for them to do it on the cells that actually matter in terms of your, let's say, whether you're getting depressed or not. Those are different cells than, let's say, other cells for the visual component. Okay, so anyway, if you want a good read, that's a great book. There's others. The Man Who Mistook his Wife for a Hat. If you may not know this, but we have parts of our brain that are dedicated to recognizing faces. Okay? That's why I can say, I know this guy. Okay? Now, if I've had something called prosopagnosia, where it doesn't work anymore, I would look at him and I wouldn't be able to tell who he was. That's why the guy's mistook his wife for a hat. He didn't see that she was she. When she talked, then he realized it was his wife. In fact, he even looked in the mirror, and he didn't know who he was. In fact, he thought he was an imposter. Okay. Now, so this is how patients with Parkinson's, and they're doing similar things with people who have type 1 diabetes, which is where the immune system knocks out the beta cells in the pancreas. So if you could get stem cells to regenerate, then those people wouldn't have to take insulin anymore. So these are the sources of stem cell and stem cell isolation. There's IVF, of course. There's somatic cell nuclear transfer. We'll take a look at that. So here we have a regular somatic cell, say a skin cell. We denucleate it. That means we remove it from the cell. Then the nucleus is fused with another denucleated cell. In this case, let's say an egg cell, an actual egg cell with nucleus removed. And now you've got a clone. And so this is the whole reproductive cloning, where you have a surrogate mother that turns into then a whole new individual, like Dolly the sheep. There's a ban, of course, on human cloning, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens eventually. And then there's this whole idea of therapeutic cloning, which is great, because where you could actually clone certain types of tissue for people who've been injured, who've had cancer, whatever it is. Now, so here's Dolly the sheep. They use an adult udder cell. They got a mature ovum from another sheep. They removed the nucleus. They took the nucleus from the sheep they wanted to actually clone. And then they formed a stem cell and eventually got Dolly. And these are clones, so when Dolly, let's say, gets pregnant, she creates an exact copy of herself. Plus the males, yeah, so that's how it works, right? Now, this sounds great, but just so you know, a lot of first-generation clones don't do so well. They tend to die younger. They tend to have developmental problems, all sorts of stuff. But usually, into the F1 generation, you can actually then get clones that are in pretty good health, which is great for if you're trying to breed sheep or cattle or whatever. So you can, you know, like breeding a perfect ribeye. Instead of having to go through the whole idea of, you know, getting the right bull and the right cow, well, you've got a clone that'll make perfect ribeyes every time. Those are the ones I love. Now, there was, you've known people who've actually cloned pets. Right, you know? There's Fido, and Fido dies. And they're really sad. They have to go to therapy. And they say, oh, we can bring Fido back. And they do. And everybody's happy. But there was a guy who did this with a bull. Now, this bull was the sweetest bull, like Ferdinand Bull. If you've ever read that story, who didn't want to fight. All he wanted to do was sit under an oak tree and chew his cud. Okay? Well, they cloned this bull. They thought they had old sweet Moo back. And at first it seemed like that, and then he wasn't. So what happened? Yeah, exactly. See, Ferdinand didn't realize you could have a lot of fun tossing people in the air. It's really fun. But anyway, question, well, why didn't he be just like the original Moo? Well, remember, I mentioned that there's something called epigenetics, which is the secondary control of features. And that's why two identical twins, we're back to this, one ends up in, you know, the pirates, right? One ends up with the pirates, and the pirates board. One twin goes back to Nebraska with his mother. They don't even talk about the father who's dead and the other twin who's gone missing, who's now been sold into slavery in Niger. And of course, eventually, the one in Nebraska is 6'4". He's a 250-pound beefcake. He's probably going to go into the NFL. He might have to put on a little weight. And for being a linebacker, let's say. But then he decides he's going to join the Marines. And he does. And he goes to Niger for some reason. We haven't gone there yet, but just wait. And lo and behold, he runs into someone who looks like him, but is only 5'8". turns out it's his long-lost brother. Why don't they look exactly the same? Well, they were separated at 1.5 years of age. They've been under different environmental influences, which affect how genes are regulated. You can imagine that in Nebraska, where you have as much food as you want, that there's not going to food shortages is great. There's no problem. You're going to grow as big as you can, right? In Niger, when you're a slave, well, they want you. They're not going to give you the same sort of diet, right? So, if you can be smaller, you'll use less energy. That's a good trait. And then there's probably some psychological things going on here as well, right? But anyway, you bring them back, and they both married women named Sasha, the whole bit. Okay. Anyway, this idea of clones acting exactly the same, well, they're not exactly brought up in exactly the same way. There's different regulatory factors that happen after you're born. I went to Santa Monica City College. There was a coffee place on campus, you know, for lattes and all that. I went in there, and there was this young woman from Hungary. I spoke my one Hungarian word to her, igen, yes. She was, but she was a rather cold person, and I was thinking, God, that's you know, well, okay, that's how it is. And then I needed another latte, and I go in that afternoon, and she's all bright and bubbly. I mean, she's doing skipping, you know, it's like she's, how are you doing? What can I do for you? All this, just in a wonderful Hungarian accent. I mean, you know, I was in love. Okay, so I thought, God, I don't know if I want to be in love because there's such mood swings here. Well, eventually, I saw two of them. They both worked at the same place. One of them was sweet and bubbly, and the other one wasn't. Okay? They had probably different experiences in their lives that have made them such, even though they're identical twins. So this, what they are is a genetically matched to the donor. The donor cell can be, you know, obtained from SCNT technology. So you want a good donor. Hold on a second. Is this wet? Oh. Okay. That's as far as we're going to go on this one.